My name's Jalani. I'm a current global health student. I got involved with the Cannabis and Mental Health Project probably around early to mid-March. There was a course that was done by Scott and Kia for my class, and I was really interested about it. Personally and with family, being from Jamaica, there is like a large social cultural history behind the use of cannabis, not only amongst within family and friends, but amongst the whole island. So in Canada, it is becoming more acceptable with everyone from different cultures using cannabis, but I feel like our story has been kind of lost in translation, especially with the racialized community. We need more voices out there to just explain their experiences. And I felt like that's where I could have come in to help give the experiences of like my culture and how we view cannabis and our relationship with it and how it translates over here in Canada with the youth.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you find that it's like captured in the course well, like that kind of like racial component in different cultures, or do you think it's something that like could be fleshed out more?
Yes and no. So yes, in the sense of in the legal and social context, because it is important to know the war on drugs and the sort of sociocultural differences that racialized groups go through with cannabis compared to like the dominant or majority white population. So the opportunities of giving it not the opportunities, but the fact that it was put into the course was great context. However, it also doesn't show the positive spectrum. It kind of focuses more on one also. For example, with the Rastafarian culture, cannabis is a positive thing and it's seen to help get closer in spirituality. So this the opportunity to provide that sense. I feel like that's something that the course can reflect upon within our culture.
I agree, and I feel like it's important to talk about that, like this experience, like legal
Yeah,
experience, but then because from my experience as a queer person, it's often like focused on the suffering, like
exactly.
suffering or Black suffering.
Yeah.
It's like there's more to the story than that, or focus on the health effects rather than like the socioculture,
Mhm.
which I think is a cool thing about the course. Um, and then like in terms of like the mental health aspects, of, like
Sure.
I guess I'm curious like what your perspective is. Like you were talking about like your Jamaican culture and how that's influenced like your take on cannabis, but I guess I'm curious about the mental health aspect for you too.
It's interesting, really, because with mental health, especially within like the Afro Caribbean community, it's not really talked about as much. Like it is kind of like that archaic kind of notion where you're just having a bad day, you kind of brush it off. And I feel like cannabis is indirectly used within a lot of cultures, not just my own, as a way of mental health and harm reduction and coping with certain strategies. And I feel like the disconnect between kind of like the older notion of how they feel about cannabis and mental health and how the younger generation feels about cannabis and mental health. I feel like a better understanding between the two actually does lead to like a more positive relationship with cannabis where it doesn't go into the negative after effects of where am I just using this as a coping mechanism or am I using this to substitute for other daily things in life? Or is it becoming more of a harm than it is a sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? I kind of lost the word. Instead of being a harm, more of like, instead of using something as sort of like prevention, is it turning into the harm? If that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. Because I feel like it's like always viewed as like, oh, it's bad that you're using it to
Yeah,
cope, but sometimes it's like a tool of resilience or something. Like,
yeah. And then I also feel like in culture, it's something that we have to embrace more because, especially in like the sports world, and for those who don't know, a lot of contact sports, a lot of the physiotherapists and doctors for the teams, they prescribe a lot of codeines and oxycontins, things like that. And it is becoming a big thing where a lot of the athletes are preferring to use tetrahydrocannabinol and other THC products because they feel like it's a healthier thing for them and it leads to less harm addiction. And overall, it is something that we just need to look at more and to go in with an unbiased lens and unbiased view is something that it is what our generation, like the future generations, need to go on with more. When we have that open mindset, I feel like we can have more productive conversations and more productive things come about it.
I have two questions based on that, and they're still kind of like within the question. But I feel like one of the things you were talking about is like where the older generation and younger generation can kind of come together. And I know the cannabis and mental health course has like the course for youth and then also the mentor guide.
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious if you can elaborate on, like, I don't know, like, have you seen the mentor guide or do we?
Yeah.
So yeah, do you find like how? Yeah, I guess that's the way the cannabis and mental health course is trying to do it. Do you think it's effective? Like, or why is it?
Yeah, I think it's very important because it allows the older generation to be self-critical about their viewpoints of cannabis. People may not think about it, but there are little things, if you look back, that was on the mental health resources where they look at song lyrics or certain cultural videos that were referencing weed in a certain way that they haven't noticed it. So giving them the opportunity to be self-critical about it is very important. And I feel like when they have that self-critical mindset, when they open up to it, they're able to see how the youth today are being shaped by cannabis. Because to be honest, I think everything is remixed just in different clothes. So while it's not exactly the same cultural references, movies, songs, it's the same message behind it where cannabis was being used as something more than just a recreational drug or just a party drug. It is something that is not essential, but it is a main component in a lot of people's lives, especially now that it is legalized, a huge stigma. While there's a legal stigma that's been uplifted, there's also the social stigma that needs to be changed as well. So with the mental resources, or the resources from the Cannabis and Mental Health website, I feel like it helps with that. Just looking at the socio-cultural aspect and seeing how they can be more self-critical about it.
No, absolutely. I think it's great what you said, like that is kind of trying to bridge the gap.
Yeah.
That it's like, and I feel like adults will be kind of like, I don't know what to say, but it's like, what if you listened? You could
Exactly.
listen to young people, and that might be more helpful. I guess one of the other things that you brought up earlier was how sometimes cannabis use can, like, sometimes it's helpful. It's like it's a tool. It's like for coping, and then sometimes it can be, maybe it can lead to more issues in your life.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I'm curious if you have any more perspective on like how you can tell when it's not serving you anymore. How can you tell when your use is maybe starting to be more problematic?
Yeah. Overall, just looking at friends and seeing from a social aspect. And one thing that really got to me was an analogy that Scott made during the class presentation that he had with us. With chronic and daily use, it gets to a point where, say for example, you're sitting in a bathtub, and at the very beginning, the bathtub is great because a lot of people use the bathtub as a relief and anxiety stressor. It feels good to go in and de-stress from the day, which is good. But then after a while, if you stay in there long enough, you kind of realize you're just soaking in your own dirty water and like everything from the day. But because you're just so naturally involved with just the feeling of sitting in the water and you feel good, you don't want to get out of it because you just correlate the bathtub with your escape from the world. With cannabis and daily use of cannabis, sometimes I've seen friends and family members get to the point where they use cannabis as a way of de-stressing from the world. But it's always okay to de-stress from the world because a lot of things happen. It's very hard to cope with it. And if it's needed, more power to you. You need to use the resources that are there for you. But you also have to learn how to cope with it in the sense of having to come back to the world, being prepared to come back to the world. Because at the end of the day, we can't escape reality forever. So using weed as a way to kind of cope with certain reality stressors is always okay, but to use it as a way from escaping, that's where I feel like it can become more of a negative aspect. And with my friends, when they started doing it on a day, they just rather stay inside and like play video games, like just basic stoner stuff, even though there's also more things that they did. A lot of them are more productive as well, but I feel like they were more confined to their shells when they're smoking daily. And it could be a good or a bad thing, like I said before, but sometimes it's okay to kind of come back to reality. And I feel like that's where the biggest disconnect where a lot of people are coming from.
I think that's so true, honestly. It's like, it makes sense to get the relief, but then I like what you said about like how you have to kind of come back to reality eventually. And that was what I noticed too, is like used weed as a coping mechanism so much in high school that then when I became like an adult, I was like, oh, I have no coping skills because my coping skill is smoking weed.
Yeah, you had a bad day at work and bad test, go back home, smoke.
It's better to, be like, oh, I'm going to go for a walk. Anyway, I have other skills. Do you find that the course, like, would you recommend that like the course is like a good way for people to kind of like learn some of those skills, I guess? Or like, what would you?
Yeah, I think the course is really effective. The main thing is because it's designed by youth for youth. Like, I feel like it wouldn't have the same sort of effectiveness if you had like a 50-year-old person telling you this is what you do. But if you had like a regular friend or someone who you looked up to who was the same age, who's been through like the same sort of things in life as you, it does come across different because we're just more naturally attached to this hearing about it from my own cohort. So that's the main thing that I really appreciated about the course, is the power that it had enabling youth to speak about their experiences. Because at the end of the day too, when just looking at Canada, it's only our age group that's had this before, where it's never been this open where you can openly walk into a store and get cannabis. So the older generation, while they'd be able to help, they wouldn't be able to help in certain contexts because they've never had that context before. So having somebody within that same cohort and that same time gap, it really does help out in terms of teaching harm reduction and getting the message across of having a knowledge base before getting involved in cannabis.
Well, actually, I guess there's this is a kind of good question too. We talked about like when you can tell that your cannabis use is maybe problematic and like that there's some skills in the course. Mm-hmm. But I guess I'm curious like how you deal with stress. Like what are some of your strategies for dealing with stress?
Mm-hmm. It's hard because still I'm like 25, so like having a 25-year-old tell you how to deal with stress is kind of weird. But honestly, it just comes from living in the moment. Like, I realize just learning through different cultures and different ways of life that taking the middle path is always the best. It's always the truest, because at the end of the day, you can't stay permanently high, and at the end of the day, you can't stay permanently low either. You have to take the ebbs and flows. So waking up, just constantly reminding myself today that there are going to be ebbs and flows, but you have the power to control how you react to the ebbs and flows. Like, life is pretty much, you can't prepare for life. You can only react to it. And so teaching yourself how to react to like those different things is like how I deal with stress. And staying at like a level of staying like a certain base level. So daily things like meditations, stretching, enjoying things with friends, going outside, just to constantly stay in the moment and not thinking about other things helps me with stress reduction.
I think that's great. I'm curious, I guess, also if there were any big like standout things that you learned from taking the course. Like there's a question that's like, what were your first thoughts about cannabis and mental health like before you signed up and to take the course? But like, I don't know if you have an answer for that because...
Yeah. I thought it was honestly like when I heard the course, it's just like a pro enabler of like youth to take cannabis more. It's kind of like a promotion for like OCS stores to have more money. But no, the really honest thing like I appreciate it is like the level of unbiased between it. You really want the youth to shape their experiences. You do have like good experiences of cannabis use amongst the Youth Action Committee and people involved with the course, but you also do share their negative experiences. And one thing is that you always share facts, statistics based on it. So giving people the opportunity to have an unbiased opinion is very important. I feel like that's the best thing about the course. That's one thing that surprised me, just the level of unbiased opinion, especially coming from our generation where culturally, through other media, you would think you'll be a pro cannabis consumption. But I really did appreciate that.
Yeah, I feel like that's a misconception. I feel like sometimes just because it's trying to be positive, people assume that it's like pro weed, but it's like...
It's a reality. Like, it's the same thing with alcohol. It's still going to be in our society, and we can have a negative light on alcohol, but at the same time, it's up to everybody to make informed decisions upon it. We can only give them the information and the coping mechanisms.